Can you get fired from your job for what you post on social media? I'm Karen Michael. You're listening to The Job Judge. Welcome to the Job Judge podcast, the podcast for anyone who works. I'm Karen Michael, your host at the Job Judge. I bring to you 31 years of being an employment lawyer, a former HR executive. I wrote the book, Stay Hired. And together at the Job Judge podcast, we are going to make workplaces work one episode at a time so that you and everyone you work with can enjoy a safe, civil, and legally compliant workplace. Now, a couple ground rules. First, I am an employment lawyer, but I cannot give legal advice on this podcast. Everything I talk about is really just general guidance. And also, the things I talk about on the podcast, they can be a little bit sensitive. And that's why the podcast really is for adults only. And so if you're listening to this podcast in the car, just make sure there aren't any children because I talk about real cases and I want you to know exactly what's happened. And sometimes that's kind of inappropriate. So let's talk about social media and the workplace. First, let's talk about some misconceptions about social media and the workplace. One misconception is that if I'm on my own personal social media site and I'm only sharing this information with people who are in my group that or I'm friends with, even if I'm in a private Facebook chat, that somehow I have a legal right to privacy in that information. And that's really just not the case. Anyone in that chat could share that information and it could get out, it could go viral. So this theory that because something is private to me, that it can't be disclosed somehow, that's not really true. The other misconception that people have is that my employer can't take any action against me for things that I post after hours on my own computer, on my own phone, on my own site, unrelated to the workplace. I don't identify myself as an employee of this organization, etc. That's actually not true as well. And some of it depends on whether you work for the private sector or the public sector. Many times employees say, I have a First Amendment right to my speech. I can say anything I want. And that's kind of true as it relates to the government. The government cannot take action against you for certain things that you say because you do have a free speech right under the First Amendment. And so if you work for a public sector organization, you don't park your free speech rights at the door when you go work there, but there are certain conditions under which an employer could still take action. Now, if you work for a private sector organization, the First Amendment does not even apply because the private sector is not the government. The First Amendment of the United States Constitution applies to government action. And because a private sector employer is not a governmental body, this concept of I have a First Amendment right in the private sector workplace, that also does not apply. Now, if you work for the private sector, you do have rights under the National Labor Relations Act, which means that you as an employee, really a non-management employee, have a right to engage in concerted protected activity for mutual aid and protection. That means that you and other employees have a legal right at work and after hours, including on social media, to discuss working conditions collaboratively and collectively in order to improve your working conditions, even if you don't have a union. So you would have a right to that speech after hours, even on your own social media page, etc. You would have a right to that speech. But barring those things, your protected activity under the National Labor Relations Act, which comes up very seldom on social media pages with respect to the private workplace, and certain rights under the First Amendment in the public sector workplace, posting certain controversial things on social media can impact your job. And I have proof because there are plenty of cases that explain the employer's right to discipline or terminate an employee for certain things that are said on social media. So let's talk about them. Let's start with the public sector. Like you work for a governmental agency, like a municipality, a county, a state government. And I'm going to use a case that has to do with something that happened in the 2016 elections. Somebody that posted following the elections. Since it is an election year, let's use an election year case. And this is a case out of the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals decided in October of 2020. And here's how the case goes. This woman began working for the Metropolitan in Tennessee. It was a governmental agency in Tennessee. She began working for Metro's ECC as an emergency telecommunicator in 2001, and she was employed there for 16 years. So here's a woman building her career here in this Metropolitan agency. Her role was to field emergency calls, and she was also certified in emergency medical dispatch and emergency fire dispatch. On the evening of November 8th, 2016, Election Day, she anxiously awaited the results of the presidential election, hoping for a win by the candidate she supported, Donald Trump. She stayed up, this is according to the case, I'm reading directly from the case. She stayed up watching the results until about 3 a.m. on November 9th, when the electoral votes for Trump reached 270. At that time, she made a Facebook post from her public-facing profile of an image of the electoral map revealing Trump as the winner. Shortly thereafter, before she went to bed, she received a notification that a man she did not know commented on her post. And the comment was this. This person said, quote, "Redneck states voted for Trump, NIGGAZ and Latinos states voted for Hillary." In response to that comment, this employee posted this. "Thank God we have more America-loving rednecks. Red spread across all America. Even NIGGAZ and Latinos voted for Trump too." The following morning, she was off duty when she received a notification from her friend and former colleague had commented on her post saying, "Was the NIGGAZ statement a joke? I don't offend easily. I'm just really shocked to see that from you." She replied, the employee replied, and several other comments demonstrating offense to Bennett's use of the racial slur followed. At approximately 3:45 p.m., after her friend and former colleague responded to the comment, Bennett spoke on the phone with her and as a result deleted the entire Facebook post. And let's just say, after that, all hell broke loose. People posting towards the MCC's page, commenting about everybody is racist, all of this negative reaction. And eventually, after following due process and all these other things, this employee was terminated and she sued. And she said she had a First Amendment right to the speech under the United States Constitution. The case went to trial. At trial, she won. She was awarded $6,500 in back pay and $18,750 in humiliation. On appeal to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, she lost, and the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled in her favor. Why? What is the test? Well, here's how the court is going. If you work for a governmental agency and you go on social media and post something racist, homophobic, violent, and all of this stuff happens as a result, it goes viral, people are adding your employer, a whole thing is happening, and there's some termination or adverse action against you, this is the test that the court is going to use. To establish a claim for First Amendment retaliation, which is what she was claiming, a public employee must show that she engaged in constitutionally protected speech or conduct. An adverse action was taken against her that would deter a person of ordinary firmness from continuing to engage in that conduct. And there's a causal connection between the elements 1 and 2. That is, the adverse action was motivated in part by her protected conduct. And so looking at whether a discharge for a public employee violates the First Amendment, this is what the courts are going to employ. This is what your employer is going to determine. First, the question is whether the speech constitutes speech on a matter of public concern. Then, if it does, the courts apply a balancing test to determine whether the employee's interest in commenting on matters of public concern outweigh the interests of the employer in promoting the efficiency of the public service it performs through its employees. So most of the time when people post on social media, a court does rule that the person is posting on a matter of public concern, not just on their own private interest. And of course, you also have to be speaking as a citizen, not as an employee of the organization. And so in looking at this test, the court evaluated key considerations, including whether the speech impaired discipline by supervisors or harmony among coworkers, had the detrimental impact of close working relationships for which personal loyalty and confidence are necessary, impedes the performance of the person's duties or interferes with the regular operation of the enterprise, or undermines the mission of the employer. Anytime someone publishes something that demonstrates you probably aren't going to be able to work in a diverse work environment or with diverse customer base or clients, you probably are going to lose that argument. But it's a totality of the circumstances. Not every time the employee is going to lose. Sometimes the employee is going to lose. And that's why employees need to make a hard choice when they are thinking about posting online, whether it's a good idea. Because I could look at 100 posts and not tell you which one is going to result in some sort of discipline or termination, because it depends on all these factors, including how big of an impact that post actually has on the employer. And the Sixth Circuit weighed all of those factors and determined that the balance weighed in favor of the employer. And so the judgment from the lower court was reversed, and the court ruled in favor of the employer, stating that it had a right to terminate her. And I want to talk about another case. So now let's go to the private sector. Let's talk about the rights of employees under the private sector. I mentioned the NLRB, that states that the National Labor Relations Board that oversees the National Labor Relations Act, that has stated that certain speech, of course, is protected, not under the First Amendment, because as I stated, the private sector doesn't have rights under the First Amendment. That issue in the employment setting doesn't really apply. But employees do have a right to express their mutual aid and protection. They have a right to engage in concerted activity for that purpose. But it really has to be tied to the workplace. So this is a case involving a woman who sued her employer, which was a bank in New York, after she was terminated for her social media post. And according to the case, on Saturday, June 30th, 2018, using her personal Facebook account, this woman, who I believe was a vice president in this organization, she commented on a local news story. And she said, quote, "Total BS. He should have taken a bus to plow through." The story was about a councilman who had been arrested for driving a car through a crowd of demonstrators protesting the untimely death of a young African American male who was shot and killed by police 11 days prior. Because her Facebook account was set to public, those who were offended by her post were able to quickly learn that she worked as a vice president for this bank, because that wasn't obvious from her Facebook page. And they inundated, according to this lawsuit, her employer with complaints. They not only messaged the employer on Facebook, tagged the company in their Facebook post, and called the ethics hotline, but some even went as far as to contact the CEO and the chief human resources officer directly. The complaints were largely uniform. They demanded to know whether her post reflected the values of the company and condemned the post for encouraging violence. She sued. She said she was white and she was only fired because of her race. And in that situation, she alleged that her termination violated Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. And this case went to federal court and she lost, the employer won. She was not able to show comparators to show that other people of a different race were treated more favorably than her. And the employer was able to argue that acts of or threats of violence have no place in our organization. So whether you work for the private sector or the public sector, I'm encouraging you to think about what you post on social media. Now, do I agree with the cancel culture that seems to exist in our society regarding things that people put online and then suddenly things go viral and then all of a sudden people lose their careers and their jobs? This was especially true during COVID when somebody had a differing view and then suddenly they were fired from their jobs. I'm not a big fan of cancel culture, but I've also worked with employers for a long time, including since social media has become prevalent. And I've seen the issues that employers have to grapple with when one of these situations goes viral or it becomes rampant in the organization and people want to know what you're going to do about it. So here's my best advice. My daughter played softball, and I used to say, Sophie, when you have two strikes, don't leave it in the hands of the umpire because you think that's a low and inside. But if the umpire calls it a strike, it's a strike. You think that pitch is high and maybe it's a ball, but if the umpire calls it a strike, it's a strike. And some posts on social media could go either way. And that's why we have to be so careful because the person who gets to call balls and strikes is your leadership in your organization. Before posting on social media, first of all, ask the most important question of all, am I sober? That's the most important question. So many of these situations happen late at night. We've been drinking. We see something on social media. It triggers us. We have an instantaneous response that we probably would regret if we had the opportunity to do a redo. There's a case where with a firefighter who posted something very racist, and he said he did not even remember posting it. He was so intoxicated, posting to a stranger from across the country. Before posting, ask, am I sober? And then ask, what's in it for me? What am I getting out of this post? What am I benefiting from making this statement? And then ask yourself, what's the worst that could happen if I post this? What's the worst that can happen if I don't post it? And when in doubt, if you're thinking twice, maybe don't post it because it probably is not worth the end of your career. That post, move on. The next day will come and go. You're going to be okay. And employers, if you want to make sure that civility rests within your organization, think about having policies on codes of conduct and social media. Now, I will say the National Labor Relations Board has gotten very tricky about this. Recently, in the new National Labor Relations Board under the current administration, they have stated that many policies on civility could violate the National Labor Relations Act. So while I believe that every organization should have a robust civility policy that is enforced consistently, you might want to check with a legal advisor to make sure that your policy does not run afoul of the National Labor Relations Act. But consider implementing these standards of conduct. But if you do, you have to be consistent. Now, every week here on The Job Judge, we answer a question. Usually it's something that somebody has messaged me. You can do that if you'd like me to answer a question by sending a message to Karen at thejobjudge.net. That's Karen at thejobjudge.net. I just might answer your question right here on the podcast. But let's look at today's question. And this is on Ask HR in Reddit. And here's the question. About 3 weeks ago, my general manager bumped into my chest. I'm female. Accidents happen. But his commentary after is what made me feel uncomfortable. He said, quote, good thing they're fake. Huh? And proceeded to laugh. I said, "Excuse me," and walked away. When he saw I wasn't laughing, he tried changing the subject. There were mostly male employees around. I don't know how he still has a job. He's made such a hostile work environment. No one wants to work with him. Is it too late to call HR? 3 weeks? Absolutely not too late. You should immediately call HR and let HR do an independent investigation. And if it's true that all these things have happened, at least that thing has happened, there should be some disciplinary action taken. I know it is tough to report things. People do have a difficult time, and unfortunately, people many times don't trust HR, but I generally do. And the option of not reporting it means that this person is going to be permitted to continue to engage in this conduct, which isn't going to help you or anyone you work with. So sometimes we have to get a little courage and go and report things, and you have a right to not be retaliated against when you do. Now, every week we drop an episode of The Job Judge. Please be sure to like, subscribe, comment, share this content so you don't miss an episode of The Job Judge. I'm Karen Michael, and you've been listening to The Job Judge.